people. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and because we try our best to provide this information in any way you choose to consume it, we're pleased to offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is Dr. Will Healy, who many of you know from other Tech on Demand videos, podcasts, and presentations, as well as decades with Ball Seed as a trusted advisor to greenhouses around the world. Will is back with tips and tricks for finishing French marigolds. And this is part of our Tech on Demand series covering crop culture for key annuals and perennials. From media selection and nutrition to water, light, temperature, finishing crops requires careful attention to avoid losses so that you can send high quality product out the door on time. Will's here to help you reduce your risk in this process. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find dozens of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. But Will, for now, welcome back to Tech on Demand. Why don't you go ahead and jump right into the presentation, because people growing French marigolds need to know this info.
Right. Well, Bill, of course, French marigolds. Are you kidding me? What would I ever need to know? Bill, when was the first time you grew French marigolds?
Well, I've never grown French marigolds, but I've planted a lot of French marigolds. I can tell you that much.
Well, didn't you have a French marigold in kindergarten for Mother's Day?
That's a good point. In a Dixie cup, I'm pretty sure I did.
Yes, literally every kid, because it's got to be one of the simplest crops ever. So you kind of have to ask yourself the question, why would we even bother talking about French marigolds? It's a no-brainer. But, when things go off the rails is when you need the help. And so that's really what this talk is about, is that if your French marigolds have gone off the rails, or you've struggled with French marigolds over the years, every so often, it's like, what happened here? Let's talk about some of the do's and the don'ts and the problem children with French marigolds. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, this works for me. Let's go.
Okay, well, let's get going. French marigolds, the biggest, number one, unquestionable issue with failure in French marigolds is forgetting to plant them immediately upon arrival. Especially early season, people go like, well, I'm really not ready. Don't have everything together. And they plant them and they end up with what we got here. You got everything from plants that take off and pretty much grow to what we refer to as stick in the pot, where you've got a flower and some poor little foliage that really doesn't matter. So really, if you don't get these things planted, there's some things you can do to make sure that they do succeed. But remember, planting marigolds, especially French marigolds first, is really critical. What you really want to avoid at all costs is holding on to them too long, that they get this huge root ball that's basically, you pull out and you see this big white ball and you say, ooh, this really look good. Well, the problem there is this is a really fast turning crop. And so what happens is, if you have a root bound plant like the plant on the left, and you put it into a pot, and you expect to turn it in, say, 2, maybe 3 weeks, and all of a sudden what happens is they don't root out. If they don't root out, they can't take up the nutrients in the soil, and they basically sit there and stare at you and become stick in a pot. So really avoid or watch for this overrooted plant. If they are overrooted, we're going to talk a little bit about things you can do to prevent that stick in a pot problem, but make sure that you do, because remember, they'll send up a flower pretty fast, because they're really, especially early season, because these are short day plants, will initiate flowers. Also, marigolds, specifically French marigolds, are very susceptible to this root wrapping. If you notice the plant on the left, the roots are going around in a circle. Once they get going around in a circle, they're lost. They never grow out. They just keep going round and around and around. And in fact, if you bought plugs where they basically come out like a slinky and they basically just pull right straight apart, that's usually because they've been incorrectly watered. You want to make sure on marigolds that you dry it down to a level 2 and you water it up to a level 4, so that you basically force the water all the way down and you force those roots to go down to the bottom of the pot, because when you pull them out, it's that root ball at the bottom that gives you the lift so that you can pull it out clean. So also, you want to make sure that you manage them at the right temperatures, because if you grow them too warm, you're going to end up with excessive stretch, which of course then you have to control with growth regulators, and the whole problem just exasperates itself. So avoid really high day temperatures. Try to keep them cool, 50, 60 degrees. These are, they have a fairly low base temperature so that they're not damaged at cooler temperatures, and they can be held very nicely. One of the problems that we run into with marigolds, and more so with African, which we'll talk about in a different podcast, but in this particular French marigolds, you end up with these black spots. This is not a disease. This is an iron toxicity issue. This was work that was done by Bill Miller many years ago on marigolds, and he screened them, and there's some varieties that are very susceptible. Any of them that tend to have a little bit of red in them are more of a problem than the red flowers, that is, have a little bit more of a problem than those with yellow. What happens, it's kind of an interesting story, is they're actually looking for phosphorus. So what happens is the plant is phosphorus scavenging. So as it's looking for phosphorus, it lowers the pH of the soil, looking for phosphorus to take it up, to break down the phosphorus minerals. And when it drops the pH, what happens is iron becomes very available, and you end up with high iron levels. So that people say, well, this is iron toxicity. Well, it is iron toxicity, but it's not because of excessive iron. It's because there's no phosphorus. In that picture on the right, where you've got plugs that are literally purpling versus nice green ones, these were actually in a greenhouse side by side. You kind of have to ask yourself, how do they do that? Well, what they did is they had them in two different areas, and the ones on the left were a little bit cooler, which of course exacerbates phosphorus deficiency, and they were using a 15-0-15 fertilizer, which, as you know, with the 0 in the middle, has no phosphorus in it. And the soil had no phosphorus, and they only fed that with phosphorus. The plant on the right was also in the cooler area, but they remembered to put on a little bit of phosphorus. They had like a 13-2-13. You could have used a 17-5-17, something with phosphorus, and that will give you that phosphorus boost, which basically makes the plant happy, so it doesn't go looking for phosphorus, and so therefore you don't end up with the iron toxicity issues. So a lot of times when you see these spottings, you need to make sure that you get the phosphorus in to stop the phosphorus search by this plant. It's kind of an interesting story. It's a marigold. There's a couple other plants that do it, but marigolds really do it nicely because they leave you a little spot, leave you a little message, if you think about it, as spots on the foliage. What do we need to do is, if we're going, before we plant, we really want to make sure that we're putting on the fertilizer into that plug, because that's where the roots are. That's where the nutrients are taken up. So therefore, it only seems logical that we put the fertilizer where the roots are. Right, Bill? I mean, that kind of is what you want to be doing.
Yeah, I would think so.
So if we take a look at different phosphorus containing fertilizers like 20-10-20, this is the formulation from Green Care. Many of the 20-10-20s are similar. If you feed at 200 parts per million, you're ending up with 43 parts per million phosphorus, which is a good solid shock of phosphorus to these plants. Now, of course, there is the concern that if we put on this phosphorus and we keep pushing phosphorus on them, especially if we've had problems in the past where we've had too big of plants, you probably want to use something like 17-5-17, which is a lower phosphorus, or even 13-2-13 if you have a lot of stretch issues, to kind of keep it down. But put some fertilizer on that plug prior to planting. You know, just as it's coming up the line, water it in with feed so that those plants are taking off, especially if you've had problems in the past where you've had phosphorus deficiency. If you have to hold these plants for 3 or 4 days with no fertilizer, you may want to add a little bit more phosphorus, like upping the parts per million nitrogen to 300 parts per million, because that's 50% more. So that would mean that the phosphorus in that fertilizer at 300 parts per million wouldn't be 43 parts per million, but it would be 43 plus another 20, so you'd be about at 63, 64 parts per million, which is a pretty solid hit of phosphorus if you're using 20-10-20. Again, a lower phosphorus might be appropriate. If you're holding that crop for 7 or more days, you may want to go and put on 50 to 75 parts per million when you water, just so that they don't ever go phosphorus deficient. Now, remember, when you take a 200 parts per million solution and you get 43 parts per million, but if you only use 1/4 that amount, so you only use 1/4 as much because you're putting on 50 parts per million, then you're only putting on 43 divided by 4, it's about 10. So you're putting on about 10 parts per million. So you're still putting on some, but not a lot. And again, then if after you've been holding them for several days, then go ahead and put on the full 20 parts per million before planting. These are all just things that you do long before you plant them, depending upon how long your holding time is, just to ensure that when they plant them, they take off and grow. And in a little bit, you'll see the real benefit of this pre-plant fertilization. Strongly recommended, especially with marigolds, to get them to fluff out and be ready to grow rigorously. We use a wide range of containers, and of course, the size of the container strictly relates to the crop time that you're going to need. The larger the container, the longer the crop time to basically fill out the foliage. And especially with larger containers, you really want to make sure that you get that ammonia on the crop so that the leaf expansion is there so that they will fill out and cover the top of the soil. A lot of times when you're starting to use larger plug tray sizes or larger pot sizes, you want to put more plants in that pot just to basically fill them out faster. One of the problems that we have seen in the industry is the issue of people are trying to get their soil costs down, especially during this time where there's price pressure by everyone. And so they're basically looking for bulking agents, different bulking agents that they use. Bulking agents are those things that you add to the peat, which is the expensive part of the mix, like wood fiber or some of the others. One of the problems that you run into is as soon as you start getting 30% or more of bulking agents, so that you drop the peat to say 60% or 50%, is that it really starts affecting retail shelf life, meaning that you put it out there, and because of the way the soil dries down when you have a high percentage bulking, more than 30% bulking filler, basically what happens is that they dry down, they stay wet, and then bam, they go dry. And as we know at retail, watering at retail is a sketchy hit and miss operation, and marigolds really do suffer from dry down. If you dry them down, they really don't look good. Also, make sure you test your soil before you start. Seeing that this is a pH sensitive crop, you want to make sure that that pH is definitely 6 to 6.5 at the time of starting. That helps keep the iron from being absorbed, because iron is not really absorbed well at higher pHs. So if you've got a soil that you've finding that it's say 4.5 or 5, because the person that mixed it either didn't put the limestone in, or it's a dolomitic limestone and it hasn't been activated yet. You basically want to monitor that very carefully to make sure that that pH within that first week, which is when the roots root out of the plug into the soil, that there is actually a pH in that 6.5 range. If it's not, you need to maybe go and look at some liming, use some liquid lime, or make sure that you're using, say, a 15015 or a 14014 fertilizer, which is more alkaline reacting, and stay away from the 2010-20 or the 2020-20 or one of these more acidic fertilizers that will continue to push the pH down. So you kind of have to monitor that pH, especially if you had problems in the past with them starting to show the spotting from iron toxicity, or they're just basically you end up with that lingering plant that doesn't want to size up. One of the problems that we consistently see, especially early in the season, is where people use last year's soil. Last year's soil, the plants in that block that are smaller than the plants on the right, they were all planted out of the same trays. They were planted at the same time. The only difference is the plants on the left in the yellow block. Basically, those were in old soil, year-old soil, or in some cases even older. So if you've got old soil around, you basically want to make sure that it's got adequate wetting agent, because wetting agent doesn't last forever. So a lot of times what happens is on these soils, the wetting agent will dissipate over the year, or also the starter charge, the pH limestone starter charge, the fertilizer starter charge, all of that starts disappearing. So make sure that you get out there and test it, and that it is that you are getting the good fresh soil. What do you do with all that old soil, someone asks? Well, if you're using large mixed containers, what some people have found is use those to half fill the large mixed containers with last year's soil and put fresh soil on top. And what will happen is that over time, the bottom of that container that has the old soil will wet, because over time it will eventually get wet, and that you can then burn through that old soil and not waste it. Okay, let's just talk about the moisture and fertilizer program, because this is really where success and failure occurs. What the customers are buying is everything on the top. They're looking at the plants and saying, ooh, those are awesome. Those are beautiful. Growers are producing the roots. And without roots, you can't make the plant dance. So you need to make sure that you've got an adequate root system to make those plants really grow well. And of course, how you do that is fertilizers control the top, but moisture controls the roots. And so we're going to talk about those fertilizer and moisture because they're so critical for you as a grower to produce the crop that customers will buy. So let's first talk about moisture management. Remember, fish grow in water, roots grow in air. So these marigolds are the most responsive plant you will ever experience to wet soil. If you've ever seen those hair roots, those roots that come out of the stems, that's basically telling you you are too wet, because those hair roots, the roots running across the top of the soil, anytime you see roots by looking at the plants, and those roots are not in the soil, you are too wet. Because if you have a level 4 plus soil, you end up with stretched, soft growth, and you end up with these aerial roots coming out of the stems. Make sure that you dry them down to a level 1, 2. The one thing that if you dry them too much down into level 1 and you keep it level 1, especially when you look at the bottom of the container. One of the things that I always recommend for growers with marigolds is pick that pot up, pick that pack up, and see, is it wet at the bottom? If you look underneath through the holes, is it tan? Is it brown? Is it dark? What color is it? Because that'll tell you whether it's wet or dry. Really check that, because you want to make sure that you got some water at the bottom, usually about a level 3. Level 2 is okay, but a level 3 before you water, because what will happen, especially early on, if you overwater or you put too much water on, you get a perched water table at the bottom, and the roots will not grow into that. And of course, that keeps the soil too wet, and then the roots won't grow, and then you've got all kinds of problems. One of the things that we really strongly recommend is that you make sure that you angle your water tunnel bars so that you push the soil up against that root ball, and just don't spray straight down, because there's enough leaf canopy on that marigold that it will umbrella the plants and not get the water down in there and firm that soil up against the soil. So you'll air gap it, and so therefore it won't root out very well. So let's talk about moisture management. Water into just below the plugs, especially with large containers. If you're using packs, that's probably not as much of a critical issue. But if you're using 4-inch or some of the other containers that are in the marketplace, make sure that you don't soak the soil all the way to the bottom, especially right after planting. What we want to make sure that we're doing is, after we bring the plants back in the greenhouse, we want to water them so that they're basically watered to a level 4 at best, and dry them down to a level 2. And as you can see, you can get much better growth and much better root growth when you're at that level 2, 3 than you do when you're either at level 4 or 5 or even level 1. So really think about what level are we watering these plants to. And you can do it visually, as you can see in this picture, by color of the soil, by squeezing it. I think, Bill, there is a talk that we do about how to measure levels 1 through 5. And so that I would encourage you to have your growing staff review that each year so that they remember exactly how they should be watering it. If you overwater them, they tend to be stretchy, as we mentioned. Let's talk about fertilizers pre-plant. I show you begonias, but marigolds are even more responsive than this. If you take a look at each of these packs, this is some work that Bill Argo did many years ago, where he basically looked at no feed, just doing a pre-plant plus at day 14, doing a pre-plant at day 7, fertilizing again at 7, and then again at 14, and then fertilizing as a pre-plant, watering them in with fertilizer, and then day at 7 and day 14. If you look at it from a growth standpoint, the pre-plant are pretty much the same size as all the rest of them. The difference is that with begonias, if you put more fertilizer in, they get hardened and like this, but in the case of marigolds, they get stretched. So really make sure that you get that pre-plant on it. If you've got a good soil that you're putting your plants into, the pre-plant might be just enough if you put on the pre-plant correctly. You may have to just put it on again and maybe at day 14 to kind of push it along a little bit, especially if you used a lot of water. But usually between pre-plant and 14 days on most seedling crops early in the season, if you're not putting a lot of heat to them, there's not a lot of drying going on, so therefore there's not a lot of clear water, so there's still a lot of feed around there. So really kind of take a look at it and measure the EC, check the EC to check what's going on. We've got an good example here where they didn't do the pre-plant on some marigolds on the plants on the left, and notice that they just are delayed. They're just not sizing up versus the plants on the right. So make sure that you get enough ammonia and phosphorus in there. And that's why we're talking about 20, 10, 20, 17, 5, 17 to promote that leaf stretch and to get that plant to just really take off and grow. It really was a dramatic study that we did. Remember, if you've got excess leaf expansion, so you got a lot of leaves and you don't get a lot of flowers, you basically avoid fertilizing too late in the crop. That's usually where you get a lot of leaf expansion. If you need to feed, once they've been transplanted, 75 to 100 parts per million plus your micros weekly would be appropriate. Remember, you can always add more. It's really hard to once they get out of control, to bring them down to size. Also, think about feeding the plants before you ship them to retail, because remember, most retail operations are just going to water, and that's about all they're going to do. And so you really want to have consumer success so that they are willing to buy again, because if they're successful, they'll continue to buy. If they fail, they will never buy again. So you want to make sure that the consumer is successful, and putting some fertilizer in that cell pack or the pot before it leaves the greenhouse is ensuring long-term success. Let's talk about light, photoperiod, and temperature, because this is really where you can build the quality into the plant. If you have low light intensity, you are going to get internode stretch and delay in flowering. So you may want, because of the internode stretch, you may want to be thinking growth regulators, especially early in the season when we're down below 12 micromoles, 12 moles per day. If you have high light intensities, remember that does tend to keep accelerates flowering because the leaves are warmer, but you also need to make sure you got the fertilizer on them so that you can get the leaf expansion. You just don't end up with stick in a pot of a rapid flower without any development. Remember, flowers are terminal, and it has a fairly short juvenility, so you need to make sure that you use fertilizer to bulk them to get the leaf expansion on them to fill out that pot. So some of the work that was done by Eric Runkel's group up in Michigan State basically did show that the base temperature is where the plants don't grow. So it's about 40 degrees is the base temperature. And as you can see in this slide, the warmer they are, the more they grow. I mean, that's kind of like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So as you move the temperatures up, the faster the response time. So if you really grow them really warm at, say, 79 degrees and only 10 micromoles, or 10 moles per day, you know that that's a fairly low light intensity, which you see early in the spring. You can turn those things in less than 21 days. So getting the temperature up will really help you move the plants along, because in the profitability of a greenhouse is all dependent on turns. How many turns do you get a year? Remember, soil temperature is essential. You can put all the temperature you want in the air, but if that soil's cold, those roots aren't going to be active, and they're not going to take up nutrients, they're not going to take up water, and so therefore they're just not going to be growing. So make sure that you get some heat down on that soil to get that soil temperature up, especially early in the season. Remember, excessively high air temperatures promotes rapid growth and branching, and the later you can plant these, this is one of those crops that I'm always mystified as to why people plant them really early, because it's too cold. They just don't grow, and they're just not going to get the development. So what else can we do for controlling stretch? Remember, stretch occurs when the day minus night temperature is greater than 20 degrees. If there's low light conditions, if there are wet growing conditions, and you have excessively late fertilization, that really gives you stretch. But the marigolds by themselves, if you grow them at the right time, they just don't need a lot of growth regulator. They are naturally compact. So it's only when you start getting stretch ones that you need to kind of go check through your checklist to see, Is my diff out of control? Remember the diff, day minus night temperature. So if you have a day minus the night temperature and you have um, more than 20 degrees, you get maximum stretch. If they're minus 10, you get very compact growth. And so, normally the temperature range that we're trying to grow these in, you get very minimum stretch if the diff is right around zero. So really look at the diff. If you can't manage the diff because of your greenhouse configuration or what's happening where you are location wise, then you need to start looking at growth regulators. When we start looking at diff, is it complicated? You need an environmental controller. I got 50 Quonset greenhouses. How do I manage this? Well, if you just use a day-night temperature thermometer, nothing too fancy, and just every day have your crew go in when they open the place up, measure what is the high for the day and the low for the night. Hopefully that's how it's working in your operation. And they've got the day, and that will give you the day minus the night. And that'll give you kind of a ballpark to basically tell you where are we, what do we need to do. So when the diff doesn't work, your fertilization was on track, but they're still stretching. What do we need to use? Well, we want to use growth regulators, and there's a lot of recommendations out there. The early season, you want to use the diminazide B9 because they're really very compact. Now, what that also does is it makes them darker green because diminazide does enhance chlorophyll so that they're dark green, which everyone would love to have. Even if they're not fertilized, they can get really dark green with diminazide. If you start seeing really high temperatures late in the season, you need to go to paclobutazol, uniconazole. If you find that it's still because of temperature and fertilization and watering, because everyone's got somebody that waters too much, and you basically, and the sprays and the drenches don't work, sprays don't work, then you may want to drench as the plants are starting to reach 90% of their allowable height, because you still got to get them on a rack. If they start getting 90%, then you could go in there with a paclobutazol drench to basically hold them down. So we normally just look at sprays being appropriate, but if all else fails, look at a drench. So what about insects and diseases? Well, make sure that you're monitoring over and under the bench. Sticky cards hanging, 6 feet above the bench really are kind of useless. They're a fun fact, but they're not useful. Make sure they're right above the crop, and make sure there's something underneath the crop, because a number of the insects that we're going to talk about, specifically thrips, are basically coming out of the soil, especially early in the spring, because the pupa have overwintered, or later in the crop, it's basically the life cycle. There's this life cycle that's in the ground, in the soil, and it's coming out, and basically that's where your problem is. So you really need to manage that soil to get that pupa. If you've got mites, you may want to start asking yourself, where are they coming from? Because they don't spontaneously generate. They had to come from somewhere. And so see if there's other crops that have got mites on them that have come wandering in. If you've got didn't quite clean up the place, and you've got some plants that hung around from last season, well, those are probably a good source for mites to come in. Looking at aphids, those usually are dropping in later in the season. Normally you don't see with a lot of aphids early in the season, but you do later. Disease risk is, of course, mainly due to Alternaria, Cercospora, Septoria, the leaf spots. It's hungry, cold, wet, dry wet plants that are running hungry are always susceptible to that whole cluster of leaf spots. Botrytis, especially in the foliage, that's all about relative humidity at night. Make sure that you're venting during the middle of the night, and that when you walk into the greenhouse, it doesn't have, first thing in the morning, it doesn't have that wet, stale feel to it, that it feels fresh in that greenhouse. Pythium and Rhizoctonia are strictly just too wet. So if you've got that, you've got to sit down and review your water management really carefully. So, Bill, that kind of, in a nutshell, talks about some of the problem areas of growing French marigolds. So any other comments that you might have?
No, I mean, you said it early on that you would think that French marigolds are easy to grow, but there are certainly, as you highlighted, some nuances and some tips and tricks. It comes down to making sure you get your feed right, making sure the environment of the greenhouse is right, and then keeping an eye for that leaf spotting. It sounds like that's a pretty sure sign that there's either some disease or that phosphorus issue that you talked about early on.
Yep, exactly.
I think you gave a fantastic tutorial. As you can see here on the screen, you can find dozens, if not hundreds, of Tech on Demand educational resources online. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. I share a lot of these videos in that newsletter, so if you want to make sure to see the most recent ones, definitely subscribe. Log on to YouTube and find the Ball Seed page for hundreds of Tech on Demand videos. And if you're on Facebook, feel free to join the Greenhouse Tech Team group. All you have to do is search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a couple questions to make sure you are a professional grower, not a hobbyist, and I'll let you right in. You got more than 6,000 of your peers that are quick to ask and answer any question that you might have. And Will, again, thank you so much for your time. I know that we will talk again. We've got African marigolds to cover as well, and many other crops. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks,
So
Bill.
I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand. Take care out there and grow some great crops and send them out so we can get those shoppers coming in for more.